Let's give a warm welcome to Mike Lincona. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Hey, it's wonderful to be with you all. And just a little thing, the reason we did an elbow bump is I have a head cold. I feel okay. You know, I'm not nauseous. I don't have a fever, no body aches. It's just one of those head colds. It's a bit of an inconvenience. And anyway, I don't want to give an American gift to the pastor. So if any of you come up to me afterward and want to shake hands, we can bump elbows. How's that? So, hey, it's wonderful to be here. I've really enjoyed being here the last few days. I always enjoy coming up to Canada and being with you all. So, but this is my first time in Calgary. So it's been a really pleasant experience. I've enjoyed getting to meet so many of you and spend time with you. Well, I don't want you to answer out loud. I don't want you to raise your hand, but I want you to think to yourself, if I were to ask you, or a skeptic were to ask you, why can you trust the story? Why do you think you can trust the story? What would be some of the answers that you would come up with? Maybe it would be your testimony on what God has done for you in your life. Maybe it would be, well, the Bible says that you can trust it. All Scripture is inspired by God. And maybe a skeptic would ask you why you felt you could trust it, and maybe you respond with some of those, well, God has changed my life. And maybe the skeptic comes back and says, well, I was just talking to a Mormon who came to my door this past week, and he said the same thing. The two of them said the same thing. Well, the Bible says we can trust it. All Scripture is inspired by God. Yeah, well, the Quran says we can trust it as well, and the Book of Mormon says we can trust it as well. So what makes your book any different? Why should you trust it? Can you give a positive case? Well, maybe some of you are thinking, yeah, I've heard some of this apologetic stuff before, some of this New Testament stuff, and I know that the manuscripts we have for the New Testament are really good, that the New Testament, in terms of the ancient manuscripts for it, are better. It gives us more confidence in the purity of the text than we can for any other ancient work, and that's true. But it doesn't mean the text itself is true. It just means that we can get back very close to what the original said. But it doesn't mean that what the originals said were true. We could have the originals of Gone with the Wind, but that's a fictitious story, right? So what kind of case could we give for, say, the historical reliability? Let's just focus on the Gospels. Well, before we talk about evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels, I want to ask the question, how do we define historically reliable? And I sent this question to a number of prominent historians around the world. They all came back with different answers. In fact, one guy said to me, and he really surprised me, he was at a major school over in the UK, and he said, what an interesting question. We get an idea of what we mean by historically reliable, but what is it exactly we mean? Does it mean it's divinely inspired? No, not at all. What about infallible? Nope. What about inerrant? Nope. What about authoritative? Nope. It's not what historically reliable means. These are different terms with different meanings. If I were to take you to the book of Psalms and say, okay, are the Psalms historically reliable? Not a trick question. Are the Psalms historically reliable? You might think to yourself, I don't know how to answer that. Well, the answer is no, they're not historically reliable. Now, they're not historically unreliable either. You really can't ask that question. It's like saying, what's the square root of chicken? It doesn't work, right? You don't ask if the Psalms are historically reliable because it's not a historical genre. You wouldn't say the same thing about Proverbs or Ecclesiastes either, or Revelation. But you would ask it about historical literature. But would you say that the Psalms are divinely inspired, infallible, inerrant, authoritative? Well, you'd say, well, yeah. So something could be divinely inspired, but not historically reliable. What about Tacitus's Annals of Rome? Tacitus was a famous Roman historian, and he wrote about his writings was about the history of Rome. And classical scholars and those of the Greco-Roman world would say Tacitus is quite reliable. He's historically reliable. But he's not divinely inspired, is he? He's not inerrant. He's not infallible. So you can have something that's historically reliable but not divinely inspired in all those other terms. You can have something that's divinely inspired in those other terms but not historically reliable. So what is it we actually mean by historically reliable? Well, however we define it, we have to take two things into consideration. Number one, we have to take into consideration that however we're going to define it, has to apply to all ancient historical literature. We don't want to privilege the Gospels in such a way as, let's make this just fit the Gospels, and then let's see if it works with all other ancient literature. No, if we're going to be fair, basically what we do is we'd go to literature that that scholars would look at and say, well, this is historically reliable, and look at the various criteria or the qualities of that make it historically reliable, and then come to the Gospels and see if they meet the same kind of test. We also want to look at genre or literary style. There are different genres of music. Well, there are different genres of literature, okay? And most scholars think today that the Gospels are ancient biographies or that they share much in common with ancient biographies. And ancient biography was a little bit different than modern biography, okay? So we don't want to confuse that. Ancient biography, there was some flexibilities in the way they would report events, some of which we use today, some of which we don't. They weren't so concerned with precision as we are today. So let me give you an example of something that would be historical kind of writing, or of a historical genre, I should say today, to illustrate a point. Now in the 1970s, actually it was 1970, you had the Apollo 13 spacecraft take off. Now I'm 55 years old, and I remember at that time, so in 1970 I'm getting ready to turn 9 years old. And so I remember I was really into the Apollo stuff, and I remember my mom saying to me one night, Mike, we really have to pray for the astronauts, they're in trouble. How many of you remember Apollo 13? Okay, a lot of you, okay, and maybe you remember the movie as well. Put out by Ron Howard, and he was praised for his accuracy. In reality, they gave the astronauts a 10% chance of making it back alive. 10%. Well, in the movie, maybe you remember, Gene Kranz, who was played by Ed Harris, he got all these geeks together on the Houston flight control team, and he said, we've got to come up with a solution here. Failure is not an option, was that famous tagline. And he wrote a book in which that was the title, Failure is Not an Option. Now, what most people don't realize is that Gene Kranz never uttered that statement. The events of Apollo 13 start in July of 1969 when Apollo 11 is landing on the moon, and it goes through April of 1970. So that's 9 months that they squeeze into probably a little over 2 hours. And so in a movie like that, you're going to take some artistic license in order to tell the truth, but you might alter the details and play with them a little bit in order to communicate that truth. It's true, and you want to portray that, but you have to keep time in mind and the economy of time in mind. So what they did was they interviewed Gene Kranz, they interviewed all those working for flight control, and they observed an attitude, an approach that they had towards solving the problem. And so they crafted this statement, failure is not an option, and they put it on the lips of Gene Kranz in order to epitomize the approach and attitude that they had. So is that an accurate portrayal of what was going on? Yes. But is it precisely accurate? No. But that's okay. Remember, they're doing it in 2 hours, period of time, when it happened over 9 months. So you've got to do some stuff like that. You're communicating truth, you could say it's true enough, right? It's essentially true. Well, the same thing happens in historical writing. You know, when you're writing a biography, you're talking about a person's lifetime, and biographies were meant to be written on a single scroll and could be read in a single sitting. Remember, they didn't have televisions back then, so you didn't have the History Channel. You didn't have all these good programs like 24 and Homeland and all these others that you could watch and that would entertain you at night. They didn't have video games. So they would entertain themselves by someone either reading to them or telling stories and things like this. So you would read a biography in a single setting, usually maybe 3 hours, something like that. So you want to condense a lifetime into 3 hours. So you would take these kinds of dramatic license, artistic license. So I think we can define historically reliable well when it comes to ancient history writing as saying that it's preserving an accurate gist of what occurred. Actually, it's more than an accurate gist, but I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. It gives us a true representation of what happened, even if not in every detail. It's essentially true. It's true enough. That's the term that Christopher Pelling, the leading Plutarch scholar in the world who retired from Oxford 2 years ago, he would say it's true enough. I like that term, true enough. So that's how we could define historically reliable. Remember, we're talking about historically reliable here. We're not talking about divinely inspired. We're not talking about inerrant or infallible or authoritative. You can have one that's not the other, or it could be both. So let's ask the question, are the Gospels historically reliable? We can ask, are they divinely inspired, and all those other terms at a different time. But tonight, we're only asking a question, are they historically reliable? In order to answer that question, we want to look at 5 criteria. 5 criteria that ancient literature must fulfill in order to be historically reliable. The first, do we have good reasons to believe that the author intended to write accurate history? That's an interesting question. There we can't actually sit down with that ancient author because they've been dead for 2,000 years. But are there things that would suggest to us that that author intended to write accurate history? Second, do we have reasons to believe that the author used good judgment in his choice and use of sources? Do we have good reasons to believe that the author used good judgment in his choice and use of sources? Third, do we have good reasons to believe that the author was capable of reporting accurate history? Do we have good reasons to believe that the author was capable of reporting accurate history? Number 4, can we verify numerous reports within that literature to be true? Can we verify numerous reports in that literature to be true? Now, whether you're looking at Tacitus's Annals of Rome, or Sallust's War with Catiline, or Suetonius's 12 Caesars, or Cassius Dia's Roman history, whatever we're looking at, you look at those and we can't verify everything in them. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means we may not have enough evidence to verify that that event actually occurred. Historians like to have multiple independent sources for certain things and all these kind of good tools that historians use to verify an event. And maybe sometimes we just don't have enough evidence to suggest it. Like, for example, I think as a historian of Jesus that we can verify that Jesus died by crucifixion and a number of really cool stuff about him, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds, that he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms, that he taught in parables. I think that we can show that he predicted his death and resurrection. I think that we can even prove that he rose from the dead. I've spent years studying this. I've written a large book, over 700 pages, laying out a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. I think we can do that, okay? But we can't verify certain other things in the Gospels, like there's not enough evidence to verify the virgin birth. Now, that doesn't mean that the virgin birth didn't occur. It just means we don't have enough evidence to prove that it occurred. And it's the same thing in all ancient literature. But this criterion is, do we have good reasons, enough evidence to suggest that we can verify a number of things in the literature as being true? I mean, if we couldn't verify anything in it as being true, then it'd be hard to say it's historically reliable. It may be, it's just we couldn't prove it. All right? And the fifth one, we want it so that there's no more than just a very small percentage of things in there that would be shown to be false. So we can see some things in maybe Suetonius' 12 Caesars, Plutarch's Lives, that historians would look at and say, yeah, that story is probably false. That detail that is reported at that certain time, like who bought Pompey's house and things like this after Pompey was killed. You look at that and you say, well, maybe Plutarch got it wrong at that point. All right, but that doesn't mean he's not historically reliable just because he got that one thing wrong. All right, so no more than just a small percentage of things. That's what we're looking at, these 5 criteria that ancient literature must meet in order to be regarded as historically reliable. Now, I don't have time this evening. I've only been given 40 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on one of these 5 criteria. I'm going to focus on the third criterion, and that is the author or their sources capable of recalling stories accurately? And here I take you to we talk about large-scale conjecturing. Did they have to do that? Now, I mentioned Plutarch to you a few moments ago. I'm not talking about Plutarch in the Hunger Games. I'm talking about the real Plutarch who lived in the 1st century, was born around the year 40, and then died around the year 120. Much of what we know about the ancient world comes from Plutarch, by the way. Great writer, interesting writer, easy to read. He grew up in Greece. And he wrote over 60 biographies, of which 50 have survived. And we see, like when he writes about his biography of Julius Caesar, of Cicero, of Pompey, of Brutus, Antony, and so forth, he's writing these stories about 140 years after these people had died. So because it's relatively recent, and you've got good records that are still around about these people, there's no large-scale conjecturing. You can pull out and know a lot about these. You didn't have to make stuff up, come up with things because there was enough evidence. However, when Plutarch then turns to Theseus, the legendary founder of Greece, and Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, things change. Because Theseus lived about 1,000 years before Plutarch, and Romulus about 800 years before Plutarch. And I want you to see something of what Plutarch says about these. And here he writes this in the 1st chapter of his biography of Theseus. He says, now that I've traversed those, those periods of time which are accessible to probable reasoning, meaning he's already talked about Julius Caesar and all these that he wrote within 140 years of their lives. He says, now that I've traversed those periods of time which are accessible to probable reasoning and which afford basis for a history dealing with facts, I might well say of the earlier periods of which I'm about to write, what lies beyond is full of marvels and unreality, a land of poets and fabulists, of doubt and obscurity. May I therefore succeed in purifying fable, making her submit to reason and take on the semblance of history. So what Plutarch is saying, because I'm going back so far into the past now with Theseus and Romulus, I don't have good historical records for it. The only thing we have is what is written by poets and people like that, and it's not trustworthy history that's being recorded. So what I'm doing is I'm going to take these records that I have that aren't really sufficient, and I'm going to rearrange them and craft them in such a way as to make them read as though it's history. But my dear readers, he says, do not be under any illusion that you are reading accurate history. That's what Plutarch is saying. Why? Because it happened so long in the past, he has to involve in large-scale conjecturing. Not so when he's writing about people within about 140 years. So what about when we come to the Gospels? Most scholars believe that the Gospels were written within 35 to 65 years of the events they are reporting. And so there's no need for large-scale conjecturing. The voice of the living witnesses were still around, echoing throughout the congregations when these biographies of Jesus are being written. There's no need for large-scale conjecturing. What about memory? This is an interesting one. Now, we all know that our memories are not perfect, right? And my wife reminds me of that on a regular basis. But our memories are generally reliable. We may forget a few things, but we will remember some major details, okay? So, for example, my wife and I are into World War II stuff. And I remember a few years back, I was in a doctor's office, just had my appointment, and as I'm walking out of the office, all these patients are waiting to see the doctor, and there was this old guy, probably in his 80s, and he's wearing his baseball cap with a B-29 embroidered on it. And I thought, wow, he must have flown one of those in World War II. And it's like, I'm just smiling about that, and I walk out, and I said, And I walked back in, and I walked up to the guy, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, but I'm just curious. Did you by any chance fly on a B-22 or B-29 in World War II?" He said, "I sure did, son." And I said, "You must have some really amazing stories." He said, "Yeah, I was in the Pacific Theater, and we were all stationed on an island, and I'll never forget the native women on that island. They had a horrible odor to them." I mean, he's remembering this like 70 years after the event. He could still smell those native women in his head. Amazing. I remember I was in Korea a few years ago, South Korea, and I was teaching some military chaplains, and one night a friend of mine, a retired Army colonel, we go walking through the streets and in a tourist section, and we're getting hungry, and we see this guy on the other side of the street, and he's cooking something in the wok. And I said, "Keith, let's go over and check this out." And we walked over, and as we got closer, it's like, that's pretty nasty. What is it? And we looked, and we said, what is it you're cooking? And he said, "Grub worms." I said, "Oh, man, it smelled like burning insects, you know?" And I'm thinking, this is horrible. People eat this stuff. And we walked away, and both of us for the rest of the night just felt nauseous. And I'm telling you right now, even though that happened in 2011, I can smell it right now. We can remember these kinds of things. It sticks with us. Maybe not so much up here in Canada. I don't know how much you guys pay attention to what's going down in the U.S. But 9/11, most of us in the U.S. remember exactly where we were at. You know, if we're old enough, we remember where we were at and what we were doing when the plane struck the World Trade Center buildings and the Pentagon and went down in that Pennsylvania farm field. Most of us even remember what the weather was like that day. All right? So it's hard. I've only found one person that got the weather wrong. Everybody else I've talked to, and it's been a bunch, they all remember what the weather was like on that day. Maybe you remember the movie, or if you've seen it, We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson and Sam Elliott. It's a true story about the first major conflict between U.S. troops and the North Vietnamese Army. And it happened in November of 1965 in the Nha Trang River Valley in Vietnam. And these highly trained U.S. troops were now going into battle against very seasoned veteran North Vietnamese troops that outnumbered them greatly. And so they're involved in 4 days of intense battle, hardly any sleep. And the Americans they suffered, I think, 251 deaths, and another 247 were injured at that time. It was just horrible battle, very intense, and the Americans ended up winning that battle and then leaving. Well, if you watch the movie, there was a combat reporter named Joe Galloway who was there, and he and the colonel, I forgot his name now, he just died recently, and they wrote this book together. It says, Once We Were Soldiers, and that's what the movie is based on. And so anyway, a couple of years ago, my wife and I were watching Vietnam in HD. And in the first episode, Joe Galloway, the real guy, was on there and he's talking. And you could see at times he was getting emotional and choked up. But then there was this one scene that came up, and I thought, wow, that is profound. And it's 1 minute long, and I captured it, and I want you all to see it. It's really a cool thing. So here we go.
Laid down their lives so that I might live. They had sacrificed themselves for me and their buddies. What I was learning was that there are some events that are so overwhelming that you can't simply be a witness. You can't be above it. You can't be neutral. You can't be untouched by it. Simple as that. You see it, you live it, you experience it, and it will be with you all of your days.
I want you to think about this for a moment. I want you to imagine that you were one of Jesus' disciples. You traveled with him for 1.5 to 3 years. And you actually were an eyewitness to see him give sight to a blind man. You saw him restore the hearing of a deaf man. You saw him take a paralytic and raise him up so that that paralytic could walk. You saw Jesus raise the dead on 3 occasions. You saw Jesus walk on water. You saw him brutally scourged and crucified and die. And then shortly thereafter, you saw him alive and in perfect health, having been raised from the dead. Now, if you had seen that with your own eyes and experienced it, do you think that that would leave on you an impression that was as deep and lasting as those 4 days of battle left on Joe Galloway? You better believe it would. Jesus performed deeds that were easily remembered. Easily remembered. Were the authors of the Gospels capable? Were the authors or their sources capable of remembering and reporting the facts? In terms of Jesus' deeds, yes. You don't forget those kinds of things. But what about Jesus' teachings? Would we be able to remember those things as well? How accurately could we remember those things? So how accurately could we remember those? Well, think about this. I don't know how many sermons Jesus preached. But I suspect that Jesus did not have to come up with a new sermon for every town and village he visited. Pastor, that'd be kind of difficult, wouldn't it? He's traveling to a new village every day, sometimes several villages a day. He's not going to have to come up with the same. Well, I mean, there'd be no need for him to do that, right? He probably had a dozen, maybe 20 different sermons that he preached. At least if we're looking at the content in the Gospels, maybe a dozen to 20 different sermons he preached. And as he's going to town by town and his disciples are traveling with him, they hear him preach those same sermons over and 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 over. And then The best way, Jesus says, as a teacher, the best way for you to learn something is to go out and teach it yourself, right? And some of them, they'd heard him say it so many times. And probably some of them had notes that they had taken and they took with them. And he sends them out by twos so they could correct one another. And they go out, and now they're preaching the same thing over and 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 over. And then they come back and they debrief Jesus on it. And he can say, hey, fine tune it, do this. And watch me, I'll do it for another couple of months before you go out again. And so now they hear Jesus again teach these things over and 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 over. And then Jesus dies, he's risen from the dead, and now for the next 3 decades or so, even longer in the case of John, they go out and they take these same teachings and they teach them over and over and over. And you get the idea, right? It's not like they heard it once and have to remember these things. It's not like Bart Ehrman and some of these other skeptics out there say you've got this oral tradition and this person passes it to this person and they give it to this person's wife who passes it to this person's wife who passes it to this one, and it's like the game of telephone, or as they say on the other side of the pond, Chinese whispers. And you have all these things and it just gets corrupted in the process, and finally after it's been corrupted, that's what we have in the Gospels. No, the eyewitnesses still around. Maybe not when some of the Gospels were written, but you've got this oral tradition that has just been over and over for decades. And at least John is still around, and these things could be corrected, and they're preserved. And so, yes, this could be remembered. This is not something that was taken lightly. This oral tradition, this Jesus tradition, was preserved with integrity. I could give you several reasons why this is the case, but it's not just Jesus' deeds that the authors and their sources of the Gospels were capable of remembering. It's also Jesus' teachings. They went over and over. Now, down in America, there was a famous speech by one of our patriarchs named Patrick Henry. And when we were getting ready to rebel against the English, he gave this impassioned speech in Virginia. And he wound up that speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." Famous speech. And we have that speech reconstructed. What most Americans don't realize is that speech was reconstructed 41 years later based on 2 eyewitnesses, neither of whom had taken notes. We didn't have the notes of Patrick Henry, and almost all of the speech was reconstructed by one witness trying to recall it 41 years later. They recalled the gist of what happened, and the historian took that and rewrote the speech and crafted it to encapsulate the spirit in which things were said there. Was it accurate? Don't know. Is it historically reliable? Partially, maybe. But I can tell you this, what we read in the Gospels, we can have far more confidence that this is what Jesus said than what Americans can have, in that this famous liberty or death speech is what Patrick Henry said. Because it was only based on 2 eyewitnesses who had heard it once, no notes or anything, recalling it 41 years later. But the Jesus tradition, just over and over, and we had numerous witnesses who could report these things. Gospel of Mark, majority of scholars today say it's based upon the testimony of Peter, the lead apostle, and so forth. So it's not like it's this oral tradition just passed around all the time. We have good witnesses for it. So this gets pretty exciting. It really does. I think we have good reason to believe that the Gospels, at least with this third criterion, that the Gospels meet this third criterion. Let me just review them real quickly. Historical intent. Second, good judgment. Third, they were capable of remembering those events. Fourth, you can verify numerous reports. And fifth, only a small percentage being false. I've only been able to cover the third one, and you'll just have to invite me back so I can, look at the others as well. Now, of course, all we've done here is we've looked at a positive argument for the historical reliability of the Gospels. Of course, skeptics have arguments against it. So if you're looking for some ways to look at things like who wrote the Gospels and what about all those contradictions in the Gospels, let me give you two sources. My website, risenjesus.com. And I don't know, like the Facebook page there, that's just michael.r.licona. It's, I guess because it's on a different computer than mine, it's split Michael up there. I got a split personality, I guess. But if you go to risenjesus.com and go under resources, I have a lecture, the ABCs of the Gospels. So there's another one, the ABCs, D's, and E's of defending the Gospels. You can look at that. Or I just came out with a book, just came out by Oxford University Press. Why are there differences in the Gospels? It takes a brand new approach toward resolving the differences, understanding why the differences in the Gospels exist. Some groundbreaking research over the past 8 years, and they are available, as well as a number of other really good resources out in the lobby. And typically, I would say all the proceeds go, for at least the book I wrote, to feeding needy children, meaning mine. But to be honest with you, I'm not making a dime off of any of those books. So, but you can go out, and if you want to know and understand why there are differences between the way the Gospels report the same things for yourself, or to be able to address others, go see the books out there in the lobby. And again, there's a number of other books on Christian apologetics that can help you learn to defend your faith and bolster your own faith. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for being so good to us. We thank you that you have given us the Gospels, and in such a way that it's something that we don't have to just say, well, we have to believe them by faith only. But Lord, you have given us good evidence that the Gospels do report accurate history about your Son, Jesus. Lord, I hope that this has inspired, that this has encouraged a number of believers that are here today who may have been struggling with this. I hope that this has encouraged the faith of others. And if there are non-believers in here that are open-minded to these things, that maybe this prompts some more thinking on their part and encourages them to look further into this. But thank you for what you've done for us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.